Are we as a nation ready to put in the money for the infrastructure?
Actually spent on salaries and the pension.
Because now if the US pulls back,
Look at local government elections, you don't see that flurry of activities.
it's been in the diversity area.
I see this as a paradigm shift.
There'll be something else because trade is
I'm not that optimistic.
are genuinely doing the work.
Everybody is talking about Horuvelli.
Welcome to episode 2 of our discussion on NGOs, foreign aid, and as to whether Sri Lanka actually needs foreign aid. And we've been continuing this conversation. Mrs. Sudarshana Gunawardana. Mr. Gunawardana, thank you once again. And when we stopped at the episode last time, we were discussing about the advantage that Sri Lanka has had. Now, for instance, when we were a low-income country, I believe that the United Nations had allocated a certain amount of funds, and then we moved into a middle-income country. Some of those funding was cut back. Now, what is the material effect of something like that happening?
See that the whole point is to bridge the gap.
Yes.
To bridge the gap that people who are already developed is supporting the developing world.
Yeah.
That's the principle.
Yeah.
So once you reached to a certain amount of development in the indicators, obviously you are not qualified to get that kind of aid
Yes.
because there are other countries who deserve to be supported. So now your question is whether we need this funding.
Yes.
So I think there's a very interesting situation now because the US aid, one of the major donors to Sri Lanka, has cut its funding worldwide.
They've already stopped.
Already stopped.
Okay.
So if we are sure that we don't need any funding, this is a good opportunity. We can say, okay, thank you very much. We don't need any funding. But why the government is lobbying and trying to negotiate to resume funding again? Because various institutions were developed through that support.
No, I want to come back to that. Now, the reason the USA funding was cut almost overnight was because of government change in the United States. And a massive policy change, probably the biggest policy change in the last 50, 60 years.
Yes.
Right? Ill-informed, maybe, it doesn't matter because they have, that is the policy. Now, their reason for cutting a lot of the US aid was, I think we should have the uncomfortable conversations here, is because they claim that most of that funding went into promoting LGBTQ rights.
Not exactly the same thing. That's what Sri Lankan media has picked up.
Yeah, but there was
basically it was an attack against the DEI policies of the US government, basically diversity. Diversity-based programs were criticized by President Trump.
Yes.
So they thought that, okay, this is not the way to go. And their policy is now more towards looking inwards, building their own country.
They are embracing isolationism.
Isolationism kind.
So what I'm saying is, so in that situation, yes, now we were so dependent. There were so many programs that were running. Now, I mentioned the BASL program that was running. USAID was also funding a lot of women's rights. They were funding smaller NGOs, not necessarily LGBTQ or whatever, but a lot of other people's rights, microfinancing. They were teaching. There were a lot of programs that they used to run teaching people about how to go forward. Then, so all this disappearing overnight. What is the effect that is going to have on the Sri Lankan population?
Yeah, it is to be seen. For example, now we have taken the foreign funding for granted. And we get the funding and we still say, these fundings are, they fund us for like various their own vested interest agenda. So now Trump all night said, no, okay, no funding, fine, can you manage by yourselves? Because people don't see the development we have achieved over the at least last 30 years. And mainly these initiatives were supported by the foreign funding. For example, we talk about the domestic violence.
Yes.
And there were people, women who were actually chased out of their homes. And they were provided with shelters. These shelter programs were run mainly with the support of the USAID funding or some other country, foreign funding in general. Now, if you have a situation where there's no funding, what's going to happen? Then to these mothers and the families and the children, whether our government is ready to step in and support, it's a matter to be seen. But I don't see, because most of these places have. And another interesting point is that in 77 or 1970, records show that there were a lot of election rigging and also post-election violence, misuse of public property for the electoral purpose. Things have changed now.
I think
but
up
these
until
things,
2007, that was probably planned. Now that has
ceased.
Yeah,
that has ceased because that we managed to establish independent institutions such as Election Commission and the Police Commission, so on and so forth. But these initiatives were supported by foreign funding, and also the organizations who canvassed, who advocated for these changes were also supported by the foreign.
I think that is a very important point, where a lot of lobbying, which is enabled by foreign funding, is not considered actually doing the work. Now, lobbying for free and fair elections, lobbying for election monitors, lobbying for women's rights. Now, for instance, in my experience, just because the act is there for prevention of domestic violence, there are a lot of issues that come with it, especially in the poverty-stricken areas, where even if you get a restraining order, where do you go? Like, you probably have to go back to the same house you were in and get beaten again because you have nowhere else to go if the infrastructure is not there. Passing an act, in principle, is just one step. Now, that is what I want to know. Are we as a nation ready to put in the money for that infrastructure? Where are we? Because I don't think it's in the budget.
Yeah, because that's why I emphasize that we took the foreign funding for granted. Now, when there's no funding, we don't have necessary means, because at the moment we are going through economic crisis, where all our revenue is actually spent on salaries and the pension. Almost everything. That's why we were unable to service our debt. And that's why we are under the IMF program, where in 2028 we are expected to resume the funding, resume the debt servicing. Sorry. So, how can we expect the government to allocate additional funding for this?
Right. Thank you, Sudarshana. We'll be right back with you. We're going to take a small commercial break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the future in Sri Lanka and how we are going to bridge this gap if the same lack of funding continues. Welcome back. Sudarshana, we were discussing moving forward and the lacuna in the funding. What is your outlook in the next 10 to 15 years if the same method, because now if the US pulls back, yes, the other countries may step in for a while, but economically the world is not at a great place. Where do you foresee in the next 10, 15 years? Because maybe for the next 5 years, we may have the money that is already pledged, but moving forward, where do you see globally, in taking the global context, whether we will continue to get funding for the important things?
In my view, that the funding regime that started after the establishment of the United Nations has come to an end, because that especially for the areas we discuss about democracy, human rights, and also basically the diversity
and health.
Health
is a massive part of
thing.
Massive part of it.
So what happened is that US, the major donor, said, we are going to suspend. They didn't say that we are going to completely take it out, but at the moment it's suspended. But I don't see some of the programs will resume. Then you have Europe.
Yeah.
And European economy is also slowing down
Yes.
due to the effect of the Trump tariff. And anyway, European economies have not been performing after COVID and also Ukraine war.
Yeah.
So you can't expect much money flowing down to this area from Europe. So therefore, and countries like China or India is traditionally not very much concerned about the subjects we have been discussing, free and fair elections.
I mean, China, if at all, it will be government to government, and then it's based on leases, it's based on repayments, and
no, there was some funding as well.
Yeah.
There was some aid, but it's government to government aid.
Government to
That's fine.
government
For
aid.
example,
Yeah.
in Polonnaruwa, they built a hospital.
Yeah.
And this, Bandaranayake Memorial, BMICH. I mean, they do, but not in these areas. Now,
Because it's not.
it's not their cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Now, my take is that in the near future, funding will dry down on the areas of diversity, human rights, and all sort of things. Other areas will come up. So we have to wake up to the new reality, and we have to see how we actually do business with these countries and get profit out of this business and how to address. So some of the areas which have actually, I must say, inflated due to the foreign funding will die down naturally.
So will that, now for instance, there is a lot of bureaucracy with the NGOs also. There is a lot of funding that is tied up with the salary scales, and I mean, I don't know exact percentage. If you probably have more of an idea of what actually flows down and what
normally
gets paid.
that you can only take 15% of
Okay.
for the administration purposes.
Okay.
The rest of the 85% has to
go
down.
and those things, and that's audited.
That's audited, yeah,
Yes.
because all these organizations are more or less registered as a companies, non-profit, not-for-profit
So
company.
when that shrinks,
Yes.
so when the money that is available shrinks, obviously there's retrenchment in the NGO workforce.
Yes.
And also the ability to do something.
Yes.
So the projects will become smaller.
Projects will become smaller, and some of the professionals already they are finding difficult to because they have been trained to do certain work, and they have been doing that work.
Because international development is a
Yes.
complete. It's a sphere. It's taught in universities. It's a
Yes.
degree.
Yeah.
So that has developed over the last 60 years. So to suddenly cut it.
Suddenly cut it, and then you can't find jobs here.
Yeah.
Even you can't find jobs overseas because that the funding cut
Yeah.
applied to almost every country.
Every.
Yeah. So my point is that some of the fundings will remain,
Yeah.
but some of the areas where Trump has objected to, like the diversity, for example, women's rights or whatever.
Which is interesting because now when you yes, there is infrastructure funding, but when you talk about NGOs, mostly in the last 10 to 15 years, it's been in the diversity area.
Yeah.
Not necessarily LGBTQ, but with women's rights, economic independence, education. So all those things have been tied to diversification because you are educating the minorities, you are giving financial independence to the minorities. So when you say diversity, it's such a broad area.
Broad area. Yeah.
And then whether you deserve it or not, you're just going to get caught in that net.
Yeah, I mean, what I see this as a paradigm shift.
Okay.
That we have been led to believe that United States is a champion of these rights.
Yes.
Whenever there's an issue, they actually come out, they make a statement, they talk to the government. Also, they support various individuals and organizations who are championing this cause.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, like a tsunami, or there's a policy break from the past, and no one here is now actually adapted to this. No one knows what's going to happen, and you can compare this with the trade. What happened in the trade?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, they impose the tariffs.
Tariffs.
With the tariff, I don't know what's going to happen to the our exports, because our 50% of our garment
I think the
exports.
tariffs there will be. I think that was mainly. It was a political gambit, but this seems the diversification and the cutting of funding seems as if it's here to stay. The tariffs will probably negotiate. There'll be something else because trade is.
No, I'm not that optimistic, because this is a part of this funding cut and also the trade barriers are part of the same strategy.
Of isolation.
Now already there's a suspension. I mean, they have imposed 48% of tariff to Sri Lankan exports to
Yes.
US, and it was suspended for a 3 months period.
Yeah.
But they introduced 10% tariff that is already there.
That is regardless of what.
Regardless. So
Yes.
even 10% tariff is very difficult for our exporters.
Yes.
So it's interlinked.
Yeah.
So we have to.
We'll take a small break. Say hello to our sponsors, and when we come back, we will conclude this very interesting conversation that we've been having with Sudarshana. See you soon. Hi, welcome back. Sudarshana, we were just discussing the tariffs.
Yeah.
The new world order, how that is going to affect the foreign funding, foreign aid, and I must say it must be very difficult for you, as someone who's worked in this industry, to see what is happening and to see where it's going and to see all the programs that you would have probably worked really hard to start with so many different people, probably just going to stop on day dot.
Yeah, I mean, it's like this. Now we have, it's like development. Okay, we were in a underdeveloped country, then we are expected to develop.
Yes.
Likewise, democracy also, we have been working to strengthen democracy and human rights. Now there's a cut. For example, in 2024 election, you must have seen that election commission was so active,
Yeah.
and the NGOs who are monitoring very active. But look at local government elections, you don't see that flurry of activities.
Yeah.
Because obviously I doubt that it's owing to the funding cuts. The operational budgets have shrunk. So my point is that, okay, now we have to learn to live with this new reality. If we have established something locally on the front of democracy, human rights, or other areas, if it is sustainable, it will stay. Even without the intervention of civil society, it will stay. It will sustain by itself. If it is not sustainable, if we didn't build properly, it will go away.
I think knowing how Sri Lankans work, we would
Yeah.
have probably been depending on free handouts for most of our lives. So to suddenly fend for ourselves,
Yeah.
and with a drastic reduction in the money that is going to come in, it's probably going to be an uphill battle.
But obviously, we have to find some ways to generate money locally, maybe local corporations.
CSR.
Yes, CSR, obviously. And also the future will be with China, India, and maybe Indonesia, the Asian region.
Yeah.
Because the US is adopting isolationist position.
So would you, when you say China, India, would you foresee a very different type of foreign aid?
Yes.
Not so much dependent on say human rights or women's rights, but mostly infrastructure based foreign
No,
aid?
not necessarily, because now that these countries have also developed now,
Okay.
and there's a vacuum, so they might also decided to step in. We don't know,
Okay.
because, for example, since US and EU was filling that vacuum, and other countries did not see that it's their duty to come in, because that end of the day we are all looking at stability.
Yeah.
Stability cannot be built upon wealth only. You need to have the strong institutions, and these strong institutions are not there. For example, now what the discussion in this country basically is about the bribery and corruption and also stolen public assets. So in order to, that's a public call. It's not an NGO thing. It's
Yeah.
a public call. Maybe NGOs have started the call, but now everybody's talking about horu allima.
Yeah.
But horu allanna, you need a robust mechanism.
I think
not only laws.
I think that's what I was also talking about. You can have the act, the Anti-Corruption Act,
Yeah.
but implementing that act
You have to build
is
capacity.
a completely different thing.
You have to build capacity. You have to train
Yeah.
people, train professionals, recruit new.
Yes.
So that needs a lot of money.
Yeah.
And we have been waiting the US or other countries to support that initiative. Actually, they have been supporting.
They have.
Now we have all of a sudden. If we really feel that this anti-corruption agenda is serious, then government will have to allocate money.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it will be just rhetoric. Same as elections. If we, as a society, we believe that we need free and fair election, then it has to be supported.
This is a good test for Sri Lanka.
Good test for Sri Lanka, yeah, and also not only for the government but also civil society
Yeah.
need to find new ways to
And the civil
support.
society will have to do the work because they believe in the work,
Yeah,
and not because you're getting money to do the work.
no, I mean,
And I believe most of civil society in Sri Lanka are genuinely doing the work, but it is going to be a test.
it's going to be a test. Yeah. I hope that we will survive. We'll survive one way or the other.
All right. So that is it. Sudarshana, thank you so much for your time. I think Sri Lanka, the understanding that we have or we've had in the last 50 odd years of foreign aid and how it works has changed. Whether it comes to health, women's rights, other rights, infrastructure development, we are in for a very, very rude awakening and a change in how geopolitics work, and therefore we will have to learn to depend on ourselves. Thank you for tuning in. We hope it was informative and interesting, and please do join again the next time.